right, good afternoon, everyone. I hope all are staying healthy and safe during these times that we are right in the middle of. I want to welcome you all to today's live webinar session on part one of Welcome to the World of Compliance. During this first hour, we will be reviewing a number of topics that are informative for new compliance administrators. We will be spending the first hour discussing AMA structure, key acronyms, and walking through how to write an interp and waiver. The last hour of this presentation will conclude with a panel discussion titled Conversations with Coaches. All right, now I would love to introduce today's presenters for our first hour. I will hand it over to Angela Tressel to introduce herself first.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Angela Tressel here at the NCAA, live on location from my home. I hope everyone's doing well during this global pandemic. And I've been with the National Office for 5 years, and I'm an Associate Director in Academic and Membership Affairs. I work on several teams, and I will highlight that a little bit later, but happy to be with you today. So not sure if I'm passing the baton here, Sarah, to PJ, or if you want me to get going.
PJ, let's have you introduce yourself, and Jen.
All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is PJ Hubert. I'm the Assistant Director in Academic and Membership Affairs. I'm in my 3rd year now at the NCAA. Primary focus for job responsibilities is in the 11, 13, 17 bylaw space, 4-4 transfer space, and also in the men's basketball world as a staff liaison for the Men's Basketball Oversight Committee. So I hope everybody is staying healthy, and I will turn it over to Jen to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. I'd just like to echo the good thoughts that my colleagues have already provided you as far as hopefully everybody is being safe and doing well. Them and their families are doing well. My name is Jen Samble. I work in AMA, as does the other panelists here. I've been in the NCAA for 8 years. I work in 11, 13, 17, but I work primarily on membership and reclassification issues. I also do some work with the IPP data management system, and looking forward to working with you today.
And last, my name is Sarah Hubbard. I also, like my colleagues, am in AMA. Been here about 2 years, and I primarily work with the legislative team, 12, 15, 16 bylaw teams, and the CA team. With that being said, I am going to turn it over to Angela to discuss the AMA structure so you all have an inside look.
Well, again, good afternoon. This slide, we are going to get through the slide, but I'd like to first talk a little bit about how we are structured in academic and membership affairs. And you may have heard us say AMA. We are all, Sarah, PJ, Sarah and I all work in AMA, and we are a department within the umbrella of within regulatory affairs. And so the other departments that make up regulatory affairs is the Eligibility Center as well as enforcement. And some facts that you may not know about AMA include that we are the 2nd largest department at the NCAA, right behind championships. And so we have approximately 75 employees that we work with every single day. And I thought it would be fun to highlight a few of the things that we do in AMA that you may not be tracking on from your seat. It looks like we have around 250 participants here today. And so we know that you may be right at the beginning of your career in compliance, or you may be within the first 3 years of your career in compliance. So some of these may be things that you know, and some of them may not be things that you have been tracking. But we serve 1,100 schools in AMA across 3 divisions. We work with divisions 1, 2, and 3 on a daily basis. Obviously, as you can see from this slide, we have specific team responsibilities that we typically fall within. We have approximately 6,700 interpretations that come in through RSRO on any given year. However, that does not include any of the questions that we receive in a setting like this, or if we were in person, or if we're going out and presenting to different groups or coaches groups or different conference meetings. So that 6,700 interpretations that we get from the membership in RSRO is certainly a data point for us, but we know that that number is likely much higher. We also draft all the legislation that you will see as proposals, as non-controversial legislation, and you can see here on the slide that there is a specific team that does that. It's the last little bucket, the legislative drafting team, and I'll talk a little further about that as we move forward here. We also collect about over 13,000 data points per year. We work with different departments to collect some data, and we certainly work very closely with our research department and our staff to ensure that the information that we do collect makes sense, and they help us sometimes put that together and present it back to various groups, whether that's through the governance structure or otherwise. We process approximately 5,000 waivers and student-athlete reinstatement requests every single year. And we have found that those numbers continue to rise. So we are looking for probably higher numbers than that at this time. As we go out and educate, we talked about, you know, we might be standing in front of you typically at a in-person regional rules, or we're going out to conferences or conventions. We're educating a little over 6,500 individuals per year, whether we're going to them or they're coming to us. And hopefully in the near future, we will be in person educating you. Outside of that, we're really proud of our support that we provide through our governance structure. We and AMA have staff that support over 30 committees. And so our work may stem from developing agendas, creating supplements. We may create some documents that you see or are sent through, that you receive through email or through the CCACA. We also ensure academic standards are implemented and reward team success and educate on continuing academic eligibility. One of the things that we do in AMA is that we strive to provide you all with the customer service that you need. A lot of times you have questions, and we hope to deliver with giving you responses and answers. However, we also know that a lot of our information that we give to you is an advisory opinion or it's guidance, and you may ultimately go a different direction, but we try to provide that information for you to give you a direction. One of the most important things that we say in AMA is that we provide or we build genuine relationships with institutions and with all of you. We think that's really important because whether it's a very short, quick response that we give to you in an RSRO interp, or if it's a very complex issue, we want to have a good relationship with you. And so we strive to have those good relationships so that we can partner with you. We also are very focused on collaboration. As you look at this screen, there's 12 teams here, and there's actually 2 additional teams that I have not highlighted here that I'll briefly mention, but we collaborate as a team. So let's say you submit something into RSRO, whether that's an interp or a waiver. We may collaborate together on the team before we get back to you. We also may cross-collaborate with another team. So let's say you submit something into on a bylaw 13 issue, but really the Division 1 bylaw 12, 15, 16 team needs to provide a consult to the case manager before responding. We certainly provide that collaboration internally so that we can get back to you with the most appropriate answer. So what you see here predominantly on the first line is all Division 1 bylaw teams. You can see that we are divided out between 11, 13, 17 is one team, 12, 15, 16 is another team, bylaw 14 is its own team, the bylaw, the 4-4 transfer team, and then the bylaw 20 team. Also on the front line here, you see the student athlete reinstatement team, and that includes Divisions 1, 2, and 3. On the bottom, you can see additional teams, the first 2 being the Division 2 and the Division 3 team, and they are not divided by bylaw. So for example, if you work on the Division 2 or the Division 3 team, on any given day, you may be working as a staff member on an issue that relates to bylaw 12, bylaw 16, 17, or 20, because you are not divided out. However, in Division 1, it's a little more focused based on that particular bylaw team that you are assigned. The institutional performance program team is the team that assists institutions with their data management system and how they interpret the information that comes from that system and really helps make informed decisions on campus. So Jen Samble is a member of that team on the call with us as an example. So she provides support to the team and then also to institutions that have questions about that data management system. A newer team in AMA is the AMA education team. I feel lucky enough to be a lead of that team, but essentially what we try to do is look at how we're educating the membership externally, and then we look to see how we're educating internally. And so we have some guidelines that we follow as it relates to what we're trying to do in the future and where we've been in the past and where we want to go with your help. So that's been a really interesting team to be part of as we move forward. The technology team is another team that is really important for AMA. This team works with the membership and specifically tries to manage the programs that all of you are likely familiar with, specifically Compliance Assistant, making updates to that group and that team. And it's really designed to help all of you get to what you need to do as it relates to the compliance roster management. So for many of the folks in AMA who are on campus, they use Compliance Assistant. Sarah Hubbard certainly is one of those individuals who's on the call today, and she is a member of the technology team. And finally, the legislative drafting team is the team that works closely with the membership on all legislative matters. They oversee the Division I legislative process, and so any drafting of concepts when it relates to the Q&A or information that needs to go into LSDBI, that is the team that drafts those issues. So that's just a very brief overview of the different teams in AMA. One of the things I'd like to close out with is to highlight that as an AMA staff member, we typically are not focused in just one team. You heard some folks earlier say they are part of different teams. So for example, I am a member of the 11, 13, 17 team. I'm on the AMA education team, and two additional teams that are not in this chart, but that I'm a part of would be the AMA search team as well as the regional rules team. Take PJ, for example. PJ on the call is a member of 11, 13, 17. He's on the 4-4 transfer team, and he's a liaison to the Division I Men's Basketball Oversight Committee. And so as you talk to different staff members, you may want to know a little bit more about them and what work they have on a daily basis, but it is very typical that not one person sits on just one team within AMA. So I know we have the chat feature that's up and running. If you have a question about how we are structured in AMA, I certainly would encourage you to send that specifically to me or to all of the panelists, and we can answer those questions as they come in. But again, that is just a brief overview of what we are and who we are in AMA.
Thanks, Angela. Super helpful. I know when I was on campus, it was a mystery how AMA was broken down up in Indianapolis. So we thought this would be a helpful tool, especially as we get on later in our presentation and you're submitting interps and waivers and saying, where are those going? How are those being broken out? Why do I get one case manager over another? So super helpful. Thanks, Angela. The next thing that I will admittedly still struggle with is NCAA acronyms. Let me just tell you, we have our own language in athletics, and they are all broken down and sometimes repetitive, and you're like, what the heck does that mean, and where can I find the definition of that? We don't make it easy always. So we're going to do a little interactive activity right now. So I will just say, grab a piece of paper, open your phone up to your notes tab, keep a track in your mind, whatever is best for you. What we're going to do right now is we have an acronym, one acronym listed on a slide, and we will go through those acronyms, write down your answer, think about it in your head, and then we will show a master list at the end of all these slides. We will be moving pretty quickly through these, so I apologize just for time's sake, but we will post the final all acronym list on the website or in LMS at a later date, so you will have access to that. All right, without further ado, we'll start with the first one. This should be easy. We just said it. We had it on the screen. AMA. Feel free to write down your answers. All right, number one, AI. APC. 3C. CARP, or CARP. COA. COC. All right, this is a tongue twister sometimes. CSMAS. CSMAS. CPO. EC. ECAG. FOC. GSR. IAWP. IAWRP. A little twist there. IC. IOP. IPP. A hint, we just talked about that in one of the previous slides. LC. LOI. LRW. LTFT. MBOC. MI. MITP. I know I wrote this a lot when I was on campus and noting what this was on expense reports and things such as that and approval forms. OLA, POPL, or POPL, QPA, RRS. Again, another hint on the screen to clue you in. SA. I think we all should know this, right? We probably write it shorthand 100 times a day. SAAW, SAW. SAR. SOC. SSI. SSO. I mentioned SSO in its full form at the beginning of the presentation regarding the announcements, just a hint. TWL. WBOC. I'm sensing a theme. We saw MBOC earlier. All right, so that is the conclusion of the acronyms that we're doing our lightning round for. I think as you can all see, we could talk in acronyms. You could write a full sentence almost, I think, in acronyms that we have. Here's a quick little checklist for you. Like I said, we're not going to go through all of these. I just wanted to pop them up on the screen. You will have a copy once we post materials on the Regional Rules site or in LMS with a full list of acronyms. One good point, I already noticed, COA, we have down there, Committee on Academics, I think it was the first or second one. That actually can be Committee on Academics or Cost of Attendance. So like I mentioned before, we have multiple acronyms that sometimes mean two different things. So it's important to know the context, but also know what does that acronym mean. So hopefully you'll find this helpful and a nice quick sheet, quick reference and quick quick trick to read some of our NCAA lingo. Also, hopefully you guys got some of these right during our little quiz. So good job. With that being said, we will move over to our second portion of the presentation, which is going to be how to write an interpretation. So I will pass that on to Angela and Jen.
Thanks, Sarah. What we're going to take you through today, I'm going to take you through the first part of some tips and tricks as to how to write an interpretation. As Angela mentioned before, as you get more proficient, as you spend more years in compliance, you'll get those tendencies, those ways of doing things which are and work best for you. But what we want to do is give you some tried and true methods, maybe take a little bit of time out of things that we did early in our career that if we had organized things a little bit differently would have been a little bit easier. So with that said, I'm going to take you through some initial steps as to what to think about and how to frame your questions when you are dealing with putting an interp together. So first of all, one of the things you want to do is identify the questions being asked. And with everything, whether it's an interp or a waiver, a conversation you're having when we get back in person or at a meeting, try to be as clear and concise as possible when seeking guidance. So if you're kind of all the way out there and there's a whole bunch of scenarios you're putting through and you're thinking about and considering, you might want to sit down at the beginning and say, okay, what am I trying to understand? What am I trying to find out about? What are the issues? And the second point there is one thing I'd like to encourage you as far as if you're younger administrators, and that's don't be reluctant to push the coach, the administrator, or the institutional staff member who's asking you to ask the NCAA a question what they want. What do I mean by that? Well, when a coach comes into your office or asks you a question, they have a reason why they're asking you to ask the NCAA something. And it may be as simple as getting them into a procedure or process with you where it's, what do you want to do? When you have that relationship with a coach, when they're just not looking at one specific bylaw, but they're asking you, what is it, and they can let you know what it is that they're actually trying to find out, that can help you frame that question. It can also help you build a relationship. Often, if a coach is asking you something or an administrator is asking you, there may be more to the question. So just don't be afraid to push them to ask what they're truly trying to accomplish, and that may help you frame the question. Another point to think about is, once you have your question, look at your question as it's through the lens of someone who has no knowledge of your situation. So when you work with an NCAA staff member, we're not going to be as intimately aware of what the specific question and the context around it is. So if you read your question and you can understand it as if someone who doesn't know all the facts of your situation, that makes the question more clear and concise and will help you work with staff to get to that answer more quickly. And finally, if you have a very complicated question, it has multiple parts to it, don't be afraid to break that question into subsections. So here's our overall issue, and here's the 4 questions I have with it. Go ahead and label it 1 through 4. A way that it'll be easy for us to take a look at and easy for you to take a look at, easy for us to put a good answer in the system and make sure that we address every single one of the questions that you have. So moving on, still working with determining the questions, you want to make sure you confirm the individuals or entities involved in the question. Is it coaches? Is it coaches and student athletes? Is it coaches, student athletes, and prospective student athletes? Who all is involved in the question? What types of people are going to be involved in the question that you're asking? So again, you get an idea of the breadth of the question that you want to ask. Do you have all the details about the specific scenario? Have you made sure you've pushed those people who have asked your question as to what else is involved in the situation? Do they want to do something, but it's during a dead period or during a quiet period? It might just not be that they want to go to an event, but there might be a period involved. There might be PSAs or non-PSA aged involvement. There might be third-party involvement. So just make sure you identify everybody that's in it and what the specific details are. Another question would be, how could potential outcomes impact the scenario? It's kind of like if, then, and then the then. So if it's going to come out a certain way and you kind of know that ahead of time, what might be the follow-up questions that you would ask? So again, the better that you've thought this out ahead of time, the better staff can actually help advise you and guide you in the path of finding out the information you need. A very important point is, do you have an established time frame by which the questions must be answered? Now, I know for many of you, and I'm going to use my personal experience for example, when I first got into my position on campus, and I won't tell you how long ago that was because it was probably before some of you were born. Some things don't change. The coach would like to think that most of the things they ask you are urgent. And in many cases they are, but there's a reason for that urgency. Know when it needs to be answered. So know when you would like an answer, but also know when it needs to be answered. So what's your drop dead date on this? And be able to clearly articulate that to a staff member. And then the last part on this slide is, are there alternatives before moving to the next step? So are there things you could have done or could do on campus that would potentially make this interp moot? Is there something else? Again, if you've asked that question, we talked about on the previous slide, if you've asked the question to coach, what do you want to do? Is there a way to do it permissibly in the legislation? In that you don't actually have to ask the questions that, oh, well, that's what you're trying to do. Okay, well, this governs that. So there might actually not need to be a question because there might be a way that you already know you're able to do in legislation. And that's going to help with your credibility with the coach. Because if the coach is going to come in and say, hey, we need to ask the NCAA about X, and they explain it to you, you go, oh, I know the answer to that. That's going to help your credibility because the coach is not going to think that you necessarily need to go to the NCAA every time. They're going to be like, oh, you know the answer. So just small points as to help that credibility and build those relationships on campus. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about, let's assume you have to do the research. It's going to have to go in the system. You don't have an alternative. And there is a question you really need to know about. One thing that's important to know is what resources are you going to need? What things are you going to need to gather before you even start your process? So you know you have those things with you or you have those windows open and availability so you can kind of toggle back and forth and see where you're at. The first thing is the Division I manual. Now, I came into the profession in a very paper era. The lovely, very large bound book was what we had. Nowadays, we have LSDBI. And I encourage you to use LSDBI because if there's new legislation that's been adopted or if there's been editorial revisions or any changes during the course of the year before that manual is put out, and you know you usually get those in August, there's quite a few things that change during the year. So at this point in the year, I'm going to want to go to LSDBI because any changes that were made in January or throughout the year are going to be on LSDBI yet. They may not be reflected in the old hardbound manual. So just a good point to look at. So LSDBI, and in LSDBI, you're going to be able to identify legislative proposals, historical information on proposals and legislation, ed columns, official interps, and there's a legislative actions and issues page. And we'll talk about these just in a minute on a slide here. But make sure that you have all of this together before you start. And I go back to one point again because I think it's the most important. Ask yourself, can you summarize the question in 1 or 2 sentences? Again, the clearer and more concise the question, the less follow-up calls and emails will be exchanged between you and NCAA staff as the question ends up being entered into our SRO. So we're going to move on to step 4 now. And with that, again, we've talked about your research. So now let's talk about starting your research. So you have your materials, you know what the question is. So now how do you get that research, how do you really dig down and get that research and get those bylaws identified? So how do you start that? Well, you have identified the question. So now you need to look at the topic involved in the request and what bylaws might be affected. So you might have crossovers. Angela spent a little bit of time talking about how many different teams and how much cross collaboration happens. It's very common to have 13 and 15 crossovers. It's very common to have 17 and 20 crossovers when you're talking about sports sponsorship and you're talking about membership. There are many questions if you're talking about PSAs and student athletes. Now you're in a 13 and you're in a 15, 16 space. So again, look at the process, look at the question, and see how many different types of bylaws might be involved. Once you figure out what those are, that's when you can navigate to LSDBI and the search tab and you can look for the base legislation once you figure out what bylaws you feel like might be associated. You can plug it in by like a natural language, what's the topic, so you can go with topic or bylaws. And once you open all that out, you'll be able to see what other information is in there. So you'll be able to see, oh, well, that was the proposal for that particular thing. So this process allows you to really start it. But again, it's about doing your homework on the front side, because then that will make your voyage, and I will say voyage because we all know what that means, through the bylaws, make a little bit more sense and will hopefully save you some time. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to discuss with you is about making sure that you've done your analysis and completed your research. So when do you know that you've got the information that you need, at least as far as you yourself, before you seek to get more information, whether it's somebody else on campus or it's somebody with us on our staff? So you've gone through, you've looked at the bylaws, you should make sure that you've gotten all the one or the multiple rules that are associated with your issue. On your interpretation request, on the front page, on the summary, it's going to ask you to identify the bylaws. Make sure that you've done that. Make sure you've pulled out what you believe they are. That doesn't mean that staff isn't going to look at it and say, oh, there's some other ones. And there's a lot of us here. Angela said that we have 75 people in the department. Most of our teams are somewhere between 5 and 15 people. And many of them have experience that goes from a few years to a few decades. So they're probably going to find other bylaws. So you may not find everything, but just do the best you can with that. Once you find those applicable rules, you will be linked there to associated interpretations and ed columns. Those are really good things to look at, because sometimes the interpretations of the ed columns have asked the exact same question, just in a different way, and you're going to be able to find the answer maybe yourself, or maybe you won't even need to end up filing it through RSRO. Again, one of those things, hey, you found it yourself. You didn't have to ask the NCAA, increasing that credibility with the coach that you're really on top of things. And if you find that information that assists in answering the issue, make sure that you attach those to the summary page too. A couple things I just like to point out that helps out too. If there's a proposal attached to the rule, you might want to click on that. Well, the proposal got the rule in there in the first place. And sometimes the really good thing that you can get out of those proposals is an intent and a rationale. So this rule came in and it's in the book. And sometimes these rules have been in there for many, many years. If you look at the intent and the rationale statement of a lot of proposals, they'll tell you why. So not only will they tell you the what, but they'll tell you the why. And sometimes the why can be something that really guides you in the right direction as far as understanding, oh, why does the rule read that way? And sometimes I've quite often had an aha moment. And that may even be, I have an aha moment quite often, and sometimes we spend a lot of time going to rationale because we really try to understand why is the rule written a certain way. And that's just, I think, a point of emphasis that it may not be taught in every place, but it's one of those things that spend a little bit more time on proposals when you find what the rule is, because you might be able to find out some really good nuggets of information. All right, well, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Angela.
Thanks, Jen. So the next steps here, steps 5 through 11, do you have to talk with anyone on your campus? Maybe you've gone through all the steps that Jen has highlighted and you realize, hey, I really need to go check in with the registrar, or I need to talk with the liaison over in admissions, because maybe that will help you formulate the full picture or the chronology of what you're working with. Don't be afraid to have those conversations across campus. And even as I said earlier, that it's important for us to have those relationships with you on your campus, it is so important for you to have relationships within your own campus so that when you have issues, you can easily go to them and you can work together. Step 6 is, have you talked with your conference office or other compliance colleagues for initial guidance? We know that there are several conferences in Division I that do want you to have the conversations with them first before you submit anything into RSRO or call the NCAA staff. Similarly, we know that there are schools that don't have those policies with their conference office, but they do like to reach out and talk with their colleagues for some initial guidance. It is really important, again, to have those relationships, to feel comfortable with what you are receiving. We have different groups that work with different work with the conference offices, and so if there's ever a question about what your policy is, I would encourage you to reach out to your conference compliance administrator to have that conversation. Step 7 has a few different sub-steps within there, but does this issue require you to use the emergency interpretations line, or can you submit the issue straight to RSRO? On the next slide, we will talk a little bit about the importance to know whether something is an emergency or something can be submitted through RSRO. This is important. Is the case involving urgent or unforeseen circumstances? There are things that are going to come up every single week in your job that unfortunately you have to tackle. You have to stop what you're doing and you have to research and you have to provide an answer. However, not everything that you work on rises to the level to submit this as an emergency interpretation to the NCAA staff. We've provided the emergency line on this slide, the extension 6144. If you can't get us through that line, you can go through the regular AMA line, which is extension 6003, and that's the extension where you're going to have to enter your 6-digit code, and it will say press 1 for SAR, press 2 for a legislative relief waiver, or press 3 for emergency interpretation. If there's a situation that involves the potential health and safety of a student athlete or a group of student athlete coaches, you may have to make some decisions on campus. And so you may not have time to call us at the NCAA. However, there are going to be scenarios where you feel more comfortable talking to us. So I do encourage you that when you have an emergency interpretation request to use that extension 6144. Similarly, you can advance, Sarah. There are cases that do not fit the threshold to submit this as an emergency interpretation. We typically say complex cases do not rise to that level. There may be an emergency that has complex issues within it, but what I'm talking about here is that you have a prospective student athlete that wants to come on an official visit, but they also want to go on 2 other official visits to other institutions. So you are working with those 2 other institutions and making sure, you know, expenses are being paid or how they can be paid. And so it's a complex issue, and it might be happening this weekend, and it's a Wednesday afternoon, and you're trying to figure out all of this at the last minute. We would say that could be an urgent situation potentially, but that may not rise to the level of it being an emergency interpretation that you should submit and call. So at the point at which you determine whether this is an emergency situation and a non-urgent issue or just a timely issue, you may come to the realization that you want to submit something into RSRO. When you do that, you have to make sure that you have all the information that Jen had highlighted ready to go. You have to identify if there are dates that you need to track, that you need the answer by. So let's go back to my example. It's a Wednesday afternoon. Their transportation is set to start on Friday afternoon when they land. Maybe they're an international student athlete, prospective student athlete, and they're set to land at an airport in your locale. Well, you probably want to have the date and the time so that that can help you submit your information into RSRO. Next slide. Again, when you're submitting things into RSRO, it will ask you for all of this information. What are the identified bylaws? Jen went through that. What are the staff and official interpretations or ed columns that you can attach to this case? That goes back to your research that you need to do. You need to explain the facts of the interpretation request. When you are writing your submission, we only know what you give us. So sometimes to streamline the process, if you can provide as much detail to us, that actually helps us because we can provide that picture in our head of what you're dealing with on campus, and we're trying to get you the answer to that or those specific questions. We also recommend that you upload any supplemental documentation. There's a specific tab, you've seen that in RSRO, If there's a tweet, if there's a web page that you would like us to look at as it relates to this specific case, that is important for you to upload, because if we are wondering about it, we may stop what we're doing. We may submit a communication to you and say, hey, can you give us a little bit more information? What are you exactly looking at? Can you send that to us? So that just delays the process a little bit, and it doesn't need to if you submit that information on the front end. We also know that several institutions keep cataloged information of previous cases that they've submitted into RSRO. Say that you have a similar case, may have some of the same facts, but not all of the same facts. You may want to submit that case number with the interpretive request so that we can look at that and say whether the facts are the same, or if something now changes the scenario, or maybe the rule has changed or there's a new interpretation that's available to us. We always ask that you provide your analysis. And on the next slide, Sarah, I'll go through why that's important. For you to submit something and not provide your analysis, it's hard for staff to understand where you're at. And so if you say, this is the scenario, this is what I think it is, this is where the conference office is, because we've chatted about this, that gives us a baseline that, yes, you've done your research, yes, you have an opinion about this, and then it helps us to determine if we need to go back and say, you know what, we agree with the staff, we agree with your position, or this is why we don't agree with your position, and this is why. It's just a best practice to make sure that you are submitting your analysis in that specific field in an RSO request. And then in step 9, you want to provide additional requested information if we ask for it. Again, if we're going through a case, and I know this happens to me, as I'm the case processor on several interps, I'm looking through information. If I don't see what I'm looking for, I may go back and ask some very simple questions, or I may call you and ask for that information. The sooner you can get that information to us, to staff, the sooner we can turn those cases around. The final 2 steps, step 10, is to review the status once you get a little alert from us as staff. So what we do is we submit that the case is basically done. We check a little box, and that should send an alert to you. And typically we provide a communication that says something like, please see the response in this particular case number. If you have any questions, please reach out. So we would request that you go in as soon as you can to look at that decision and then accept that decision to really close out the case so that both parties can move on. Finally, as we wrap up how to submit an interp, it's important for you to contact everyone that's involved in that particular case. This kind of goes without saying, but if it involves a student athlete or a prospect or their family or a coach, you certainly want to share that information as soon as possible. A lot of times staff will say, hey, they'll call you and say, hey, I don't have this in writing, but here's the answer, and I'm going to get you the written answer as soon as possible. If they give you a verbal response, you can share that information with the constituents that are involved. So I know that that is a really long process, but we tried to break it down so that it makes sense to you if you're submitting a case in any of the bylaws that we highlighted earlier on in this presentation. So I'm going to pause there. I'm not sure if there's been some questions that have come in, but again, if you'd like to submit any questions in the chat feature, you certainly can send that to all panelists and we will take a look at that. But for the time being, I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah and PJ on how to write a waiver.
Thanks, Angela. I appreciate it. Again, good afternoon, everybody. So we're going to transition into how to write a waiver. And this is not totally a separate process, right? I mean, we go about everything and we look at it more from an interpretive side first. So, you know, is this interpretively, can we get to a yes? Is there flexibility related to the issue that is being asked to find an interpretive outcome? If the answer is no, and we need to go the waiver route, this is just to kind of help everybody, you know, I guess put forth the best argument in terms of building a complete waiver. So we have here a 12-step process, and by no means is this all-inclusive or anything like that, but trying to hit on the main points on how to build an appropriate and complete waiver. So we'll look at step one, and some of these are very similar to how to write an interpretation in at least the analysis piece. So in step one, it's what is the ask? So after you've probably been asked if a coach or whoever may be able to do this or that, and the answer is no, you've already pretty much identified at least what the individual is asking you to look into. And this kind of creates this whole cycle, right, of looking into the analysis on your end. And many times we see waivers come through. I'll kind of preface this whole thing with, we love to see as much information as possible in these cases that are submitted through RSRO. Again, like Angela said, the more information that are in these cases and the more digging and analysis that you all do from the institutional standpoint only helps us as staff dive into your ask. So providing more information in those cases help us even get a kickstart in what we need to do and identify the appropriate bylaws. So again, step one is identifying the question and what needs waived. And not all the time, but most times we're even looking at cases where you're looking to identify maybe a couple different bylaws that need to be waived. Maybe it's not just one specific bylaw. Maybe a couple bylaws need to be waived and it's over multiple teams. So from our process, we would have to engage and work with kind of a cross-team, cross-bylaw team effort to get an answer. So I think the whole analysis piece and understanding what the ask is of you and what we're trying to waive is the key to at least starting to develop and describe a well thought out waiver. When we look at step two, this kind of builds again off the analysis piece and what all tools you have in front of you to help determine or provide the best argument for a waiver description. So start off with your NCAA manual, right? What's the base bylaw of what we're looking at? LSDBI, legislative proposals on the intent and rationale, and use those a little bit in terms of maybe these are more, help you interpretively with the ed columns and official interps and such, but at least it provides you a historical and a perspective on where staff and the membership has been in the past, and can help you kind of paint an argument, if you will, of what you're trying to get across in a waiver setting. So step 3 and 4. Step 3, again, similar to the interpretive side. Have you talked to your conference or other compliance colleagues? I come from a conference background, previous employer, and I can't tell you how great it was to engage with our member institutions in the conference, right? If they needed help or needed a little guidance, just somebody else other than the specific member institution and those in their office to just chat through items. So have you started with your conference office? What does your director of compliance or senior compliance administrator at that conference level, what does he or she have to say about it? Other compliance colleagues, what's NAC saying? What's going on in the NAC board meeting or NAC boardroom? CCACA, a lot of waiver solutions or interpretive analysis go through that CCACA group, which is a conference kind of set up for these specific compliance-related items and issues. Step 4 is related to, is a phone waiver necessary, and how to go about requesting a phone waiver. And I know Angela touched on this at the end of her presentation on how to write an interp, and it's pretty much the same in terms of the process. The phone waivers may be a little bit different. I think it's all about urgency maybe and unforeseen circumstances. If it's a complex issue, and we'll get to kind of what doesn't rise to the level of an urgent phone waiver, but it's something that's relatively simple and straightforward, we have that 6144 number for institutions to call. A lot of times we see maybe that's something to do with a student-athlete well-being issue, some sort of inclement weather issue, catastrophic events, death, etc. So understanding what to put forth as an urgent phone waiver. And then obviously, if that does rise, your issue does rise to a phone waiver, we have staff that monitors the phones. One of our bylaw team members will get back to you pretty much within that same day and provide you with an analysis and an answer to move forward. And again, that later submission in RSRO is just a policy for 10 days after you receive a phone waiver, or at least in that 10-day window, to go ahead and put that in the RSRO so we can have that for tracking purposes on our end, so we have a little bit of precedent. Continuing on with step 4, related to items that may not rise to the level of an urgent phone waiver. Again, I think there's a thin line between what can and cannot be looked at from a phone waiver standpoint, right? So if there's a lot of information and it seems to be a complex issue, generally we're going to say to please put it forth in RSRO and mark it as urgent. As our bylaw team leads and our team will want to review that in totality and whole instead of making a quick fire off the seat of our pants answer, right? With that, transfer waivers, delayed enrollment waivers, blanket waivers, anything that may need more than a simple analysis and check on precedent, generally will not be a phone waiver. So the examples here listed from the transfer, delayed enrollment, blanket waiver standpoint, those are all issues, topics of waivers that we have that generally can take a few weeks to a month even, right? With the whole process that we use with visiting with our team. Is there any outside legal counsel that we need to talk to from our legal affairs standpoint? Does it need to be run by a membership committee? From my standpoint, I help with the men's basketball side. Does a men's basketball issue need to be taken to MBOC for review before the team issues a final outcome? So I think generally, you know, the perspective on campus that was mentioned in the interpretive side of it was, you know, this appears to be urgent and we'd like to have an answer as soon as possible. And believe me, we certainly want to have those responses to you as soon as possible in a timely fashion. But sometimes it requires a little bit more review from more than just our bylaw team or our leads or our staff. So transitioning to step 5, determining what kind of waiver you need. We have all different kinds of waivers, and it may be more than just a simple legislative relief waiver of a bylaw, right? Full-time enrollment, hardship waivers, season of competition waivers, initial eligibility waivers, transfer waivers, PTD waivers, extension of the 5-year clock. These are all relatively complex waiver topical areas that generally don't take a few days, right? I mean, it takes, you know, a staff analysis to review, run it by team, and sometimes, like I said, legal counsel, etc. And not all of these issues are reviewed by the same teams either. We have our SAR team for student-athlete reinstatement. We have our bylaw teams for bylaw-specific areas. We have transfer teams for 2-4 and 4-4 transfers, right? We have folks that work in the initial eligibility space for eligibility waivers. SAR does hardship waivers. So then, you know, it's not just a blanket of when the member institution submits a waiver that it just goes to the kind of the next person up. There's a little bit more of a process on determining, you know, what team does this go to and who's available to take the lead on such a case. So hopefully that paints a little bit of a better picture on what that process looks like in terms of, I guess, determining which waiver to use or which waiver you need. And I think as part of that in RSRO, all these different waiver categories require different pieces of criteria that need to be met before you can even submit the waiver, right? So if you've ever submitted a waiver on campus or from a conference perspective, it'll ask you, you know, 3 to 5 to 6 or 7 different items, documents that you need to at least meet the threshold to submit the waiver to staff. So I think just understanding that, at least having a broad understanding of what is necessary in terms of your analysis and what kind of waiver is at least needed can help you build in that process. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Sarah to take us from step 6 through step 12 of this waiver process.
Thanks, PJ. So similar to what we saw in the INTERP how-to guidelines, going to be very similar, like PJ said. So step six, identify impacted bylaws. So again, just like our INTERP process, this is going to help staff identify where this waiver needs to go, which team it needs to be assigned to. It also helps the case manager determine, okay, what are you asking of the staff to waive? What's your question? Where is that rooted in the manual and the legislation? So I think that's important, where maybe we find sometimes the facts or the question isn't always clear. Sometimes we have to do a little bit of interpreting ourselves of, okay, they've tied this bylaw to the waiver. Maybe they're asking this. But again, that will, being concise with what your request is, as well as identifying the correct bylaws, helps us put that picture together and answer that request accurately. Step 7, explaining the facts of the waiver request. So I think what's important in this section that I want to stress is the fact that, hey, let's throw our English class, 10th grade English or whatever, out the window. We don't need to necessarily see the facts of your waiver request in paragraph format. We do see that. Pretty much all of our cases are like that. However, I think what I want to stress to you, is it better to see the facts of your waiver request in a bullet format or a timeline format? Maybe that helps us break down what's happening within the waiver and the facts of that waiver request more clearly. So keep that in mind. I think if you don't put a timeline or bullet points within the facts of the waiver requests on the main page, providing a timeline, for example, for delayed enrollment purposes, those waivers, that's super helpful and likely something that staff would come back and ask for anyways. So I think that's important to remember. Step 8, what is your mitigation? What makes your case unique and need relief from the legislation? What's going on with your student athlete situation if you're seeking relief for a student athlete or a PSA? What's going on that makes your case unique and that we can distinguish from everyday activity? So I think common things that you will be asked for is definitely a student athlete statement. If it's something involving a student athlete, a request, we're definitely going to ask for the student athlete. Tell them to write their story. What's going on? We see this in the delayed enrollment space. Why did they delay their enrollment or play in a number of games which caused the delay in their enrollment? Things like that. An institutional statement. Maybe it's an institution made an error. What were the circumstances around that, which is now seeking relief from the staff? I already mentioned outlining a timeline, super helpful. Any other documentation, maybe that's, financial records or outside emails or text messages, anything of that nature that can be included and uploaded. Again, like my colleague said, just painting a picture of what is going on in your particular situation. Step 9, what is your analysis of the request? Similar to what we talked about in the INTERP side, we like to know what you're thinking. Why does your request, your situation need relief from the legislation? Is this something that, was unforeseen and very unique and just happened out of the blue and, you really don't have common things happening, these common things happening every day? Is it a student athlete well-being issue? How will this affect and impact student athletes and their livelihood or their college experience, things like that? the intent of the legislation, I think that goes back to our historical research and looking at the proposals and what the intent and rationales include. Is this waiver really not, is the intent of the legislation really not getting at your situation? There should be relief in this situation. Most common, there's no recruiting or competitive advantage. Show us how that's so and provide that statement. And then, of course, you're able to look up case precedent in RSRO and compare your facts to other waivers and provide that information to staff so that they can quickly compare and look at how those cases compare. So all super helpful. It gives us an idea of where you're coming from and your thought process. And like PJ said, and oftentimes with complex cases or cases we haven't seen precedent on, we're bringing them to our team meetings and discussing. This paints a picture so that the case manager can relay the institution's point of view to the team and they can further discuss. Step 10, again, we've seen this a lot. Is this a waiver urgent? PJ touched on it. Is it time sensitive? Does the student athlete or institution have upcoming competition that is affected by this waiver would be? Does it impact the student athlete's eligibility? Taking a look at all of that. I think it's important too to remind, I think staff likes to remind people that, just because waiting till the last second for you have competition on Friday, you submit on Wednesday, isn't always going to get you a cleared or approved waiver. Give us time. Make sure you're submitting requests in so they don't become urgent. If you know of a delayed enrollment case, now in June, and they're a fall sport, submit it now. Get your documentation together and go ahead and submit that information. That helps us walk through, especially if oftentimes with those cases, we're going to have to request additional information or there'll be follow-up questions. So it does take some time. Step 11, reviewing the staff decision. Just like the staff will provide that notification to the membership regarding the outcome of their waiver. So making sure that you understand, are there any conditions set upon this waiver? There's a separate box for that will outline what conditions. If there are no conditions, there'll just be a rationale and how the staff came to that decision and outcome, and that will break it down. So making sure that you understand what that decision is and how it's being reflected. Step 12, I think it's important that on your end, this is where you guys come in even more and wrap it up with a nice neat bow. Contacting the parent, the student athlete, the coach, whoever is involved with this waiver about the outcome of the request. Explaining to them, what it was, if it's an approval, if it's a denial, and why that is. And like we mentioned before, there are lots of resources that are available that you may not even need a waiver for, and it just might take a little bit of searching. We have blanket waiver requests, previously approved checklists, incidental expense waivers. These can all be found, especially when they're updated on LSDBI, the announcement page. So you should be monitoring that home page frequently, daily, to see those announcements and those updates come through. We also have the waiver guidelines and directives that you can find on .org. And then, of course, reaching out to NCAA staff, as you can see in the contact information below. I do want to do a shameless plug. You will find on .org or later on LMS a tutorial recording video of Angela and myself interviewing Marie Dillon, who will walk you through how to submit and more of the technical side of things through RSRO. So that recording will be available and up for your reference, and we'll also be able to compare to this recording. So feel free, if you have any questions about this first session's content, feel free to use the emails on your screen right now, or the chat function still is up and running. And we will be transitioning into our second session in just 1 minute, our conversation with coaches. So please continue to join us. Thank you.
Sarah, I will address one quick question that came through the chat related to, will step 9 of going through the step-by-step process on how to submit a waiver, is that completed in the institutional statement that would be submitted in step 8? So if you recall, step 9 is kind of what is your analysis from an institutional perspective? Does it impact student athlete well-being, intent of legislation, is there case precedent, et cetera? And then step 8 was, kind of identifying and gathering all the necessary documentation that you'll need in the case. So an institutional statement, a student athlete statement, if there's a timeline that's necessary for the specific case. I think generally as a best practice, the answer to that is yes. Those institutional statements are very, most of the time from a staff member that handles cases, that may be the first thing we read is kind of lay out your issue, lay out everything associated with that case, precedent, your institutional argument on why such a waiver needs to be approved. Lay that out in your institutional statement. There's also sections as part of the RSRO submission boxes that you can basically share what the conference's analysis was or is, and also what your institutional analysis was or is. So if that is in both of those, your institutional statement and that RSRO box, that's even better. That just is more information and more places that we have and that we can look at to identify what all is involved in this case.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. A few of you may have just joined us, and so again, this is a panel on working with coaches. We have a great group here today. We are all staff members at the NCAA. However, as you will find out through their introduction, they weren't always at the NCAA national office. So again, thank you for joining us. If you have just joined, my name is Angela Trussell, and I'm an associate director in AMA. And I am joined today by Sarah Hebard, who has been speaking, and we're going to moderate a quick panel for all of you, because we know as new compliance administrators or even veteran compliance administrators, it can be difficult to talk with certain coaches and how you work through certain scenarios. So I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Awesome, thanks Angela. All right, to kick things off, I'm going to introduce our guests today, starting with Chris Johnson, an Assistant Director of AMA, Bud Pugh, an Assistant Director in AMA, Deshia Phillips, another Assistant Director in AMA, Mason Hines, an Assistant Director in AMA, Trey Stallings, an Assistant Director in Enforcement, and Brian Thornton, an Assistant Director in Enforcement. So welcome everyone. I hope you all are doing well. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to start off with our panelists giving us a brief introduction of your path to the NCAA, your current role at the NCAA, and how long you've been at the national office. In the same order as we see on the screen, we'll start off with Chris and move our way through. We'll hand it over to you, Chris.
Awesome, thank you, Sarah. So as Sarah said, my name is Chris Johnson, and I came to the NCAA from the University of Oklahoma. I started in 2012 at the University of Oklahoma, worked at the University of Oklahoma until March 2019. I did topics related to recruiting, playing seasons, and then I did a lot of monitoring as well from 2012 to 2015. Right now, I'm an assistant director with the NCAA. I've been here a little over a year. I serve on the 4-4 transfer team and the 11-13-17 bylaw team as well. I also assist with Football Oversight Committee, or FOC, and the Committee for Legislative Relief. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks. I'll head it over to Bud now.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so I took a little bit of a different route to college athletics. My first job after college was a sales role, and I did that in plastics industry and financial services. And I kind of did that until I got tired of making a decent living and decided to pry my way into college athletics. So I begged and pleaded pretty much with anyone that would listen to me, and eventually landed an intern position in the compliance office at Clemson University. I was fortunate enough to work on the athletic compliance staff at Clemson for 6 years, starting from filing documents to growing to the whole gamut of monitoring tasks and eventually handling initial eligibility and rules education. Again, stars aligned in my favor, and I got an opportunity with the national office. Been here since July 2019. And I serve on the bylaw 111317 team, 4-4 transfer, education and technology teams. Thanks, Sarah.
Awesome, thanks, Bud. All right, Mason, can you tell us about your journey?
Hey, Sarah. Yeah, so I started after I got done with law school. I started as a post-grad intern in AMA with the Student Athlete Reinstatement Team. I did that from 2016 to 2017. After my internship, I got a job at the University of Mississippi, and I worked there from 2017 until this past November. And while at Ole Miss, I did the day-to-day compliance, monitoring, and education and things for recruiting and financial aid, and then started back with the Student Athlete Reinstatement Team just this last November of 2019, and I'm working with them. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Mason. All right, Tashia, let's share with the audience your fun past.
So after my time as a Division I student athlete at Xavier University, I was drafted to play in the WNBA. I played for a year. I got out of the WNBA and decided that I was going to take a break from basketball. From my break, I ended up coaching. So I coached high school for a year, coached at junior college for a year out in Garden City, and then I transferred my little self all the way back to Indianapolis, back home to coach at Division II, University of Indianapolis. Prior to working at the NCAA, my first job actually at the NCAA was a contractor in the Eligibility Center, and now I have been in AMA as an assistant director on the Student Athlete Reinstatement Team since this past November, so a little under a year. Thanks, Sarah.
Awesome. We're glad to have you. All right, Trey, your turn. You're up.
I actually came to the NCAA from the University of Illinois. I spent 2 years basically serving on support staff at the University of Illinois. Prior to that, I worked for the Tennessee Titans for 2 years in their front office. And before then, I worked at conference offices in the Pac-12 and the SEC. So a little bit of coaching / administration work. And I've been at the NCAA for almost 2 years.
Awesome. Thanks, Trey. All right, Brian, certainly last but not least, round us up with your experience.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for allowing me to be part of this panel. My name is Brian Thornton, as Sarah said, and I'm an assistant director in enforcement, and I have been in enforcement at the NCAA for close to 2 years. Ironically, Trey and I started on the same exact day, so we have that in common. Prior to coming to the NCAA, I spent 10 years as a Division I basketball coach at several different universities. I was fortunate to have the experience of coaching at basically every level of Division I, from your lower major schools to high major institutions. So fortunately, I have the understanding of kind of riding on buses and flying on private planes. So it was a great experience, but I'm certainly enjoying my time at the NCAA now. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, guys. So as you can see, we have a wide variety in our panelists. I'm excited for you all to get to know them and some of their tools and tips. I'm going to pass it on to Angela for our first set of questions.
Thanks, Sarah. Hopefully my video will pop up as well. But I'd like to focus this first question to Bud or Oliver. I'm not sure which one you said when you introduced yourself. But if we can, you talked a little bit about your journey as it related to getting into compliance. That wasn't something that you did right out of college, but flash back to your first time walking onto campus as a compliance administrator. now that you're more seasoned, what is something that you did or what is something that you had to learn to do when it comes to getting on the right foot with a new coach that you were going to be working with?
That's a great question, Angela. I appreciate it. You know, I think going into a position like this, I wanted to make a good impression with colleagues, coaches, other administrators. I wanted to be a dependable source of information, provide great service, all that good stuff. Didn't want to really seem like the new guy. Early on, you know, I think the biggest thing I had to learn was to slow my pace down. And what I mean by that, you all get to know this business, and you know coaches and colleagues around the athletic department. They all operate at one speed, and that's full speed. You know, they need things right now. I learned that I can't always operate at their pace, you know, because there's risk in the work that we're doing. And we provide a response without consulting our resources, and we create more risk and possibly issues. So, you know, you probably heard this before. You get a question, even though you may know it off the top of your head. You know, it's a good exercise to slow your pace, consult your resources, check your manual, LSDBI, RSRO cases, a colleague at another institution. Just go through your steps and take your time. Just really make sure that you're providing the most accurate information possible. Also, I think it's a good practice to explain to your coaches or colleagues what you're doing to address the question. I think this is important for you to take those steps. You know, heck, I've been in this business for 7 years, and in that time span, I can't tell you how many times, you know, official visit rules have changed. You know, so, you know, not to mention all the chatter and the proposals that you hear that never even come to fruition. So, I mean, just don't be a victim to trying to do too much. Take your time, slow your pace, and go through your steps in providing responses.
That's helpful. I think, you know, as a new compliance administrator, there's a lot to tackle, right? What are some of the characteristics that you think are important for anyone to be a successful compliance administrator?
Yeah, so I think, especially early on, gotta be disciplined, gotta be consistent. I mean, that's kind of all lumped in one. This is a job that's got some repetitive tasks, and you know, a lot of the tasks you do are going to be similar to the tasks you're going to be doing next week and the month after that, and next year. So you got to be able to handle tasks with a high level of care throughout the year. Another one I think is important, and I'm not even sure it's really a characteristic, but you can't be one that really worries about being a people pleaser. I mean, this is one that's always been hard for me. You know, I still have to fight with my natural desire to be nice and tell people what they want to hear. But you can't really do that in this business. You got to be upfront, be clear, honest, and it may be painful in the moment, but in the long run, people will respect you for good guidance, no matter, you know, the initial emotional impact. And then self-confidence, I think, is another big one. You know, you can't be wishy-washy in your communication. It comes out that you're unsure about something. You know, self-confidence in the compliance work is not necessarily about just coming up with an answer and just having some strong conviction about it. It's about being okay with acknowledging what you don't know and being upfront about it and just demonstrating that you do have the ability to obtain accurate information. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest pieces of building credibility in this business.
That's helpful. I want to ask a similar question to our former coaches on the call. And it's okay if you have a different opinion here, but I guess this would be then for Brian, Trey, and Tashia. Can you, from a coach's perspective, tell us what makes a compliance administrator more appealing to work with? And maybe we'll start with Brian on that one.
You know, I think that from a coach's standpoint, one of the most appealing things about a compliance person is just feeling like we're on the same team. You know, that all oars are rowing in the same direction. And, you know, I think that so often there's kind of an adversarial relationship that somehow tends to develop between coaches and compliance officers. And I think that the better working relationship that you can have together gives everybody the best chance for success. You know, from a coaching standpoint, coaching is a game of inches. And, you know, the margins are extremely small. And knowing that you have a compliance person that is willing to kind of go the extra mile, to take the extra steps necessary to to figure out answers that could end up saving your job or giving you an opportunity to win at a certain level, that speaks volumes to those coaches. So, you know, I just think that any time that you can reinforce that you're on the same team, and that we're working together, that we're not working in opposition of each other, I think that goes a long way to building that relationship and something that coaches are certainly looking for.
Great. Same question to you. We'll toss it to Tashia. What do you think are some qualities that make the compliance administrator more appealing to work with?
I'm definitely going to echo Brian, and not just because we went to the same school, but because he's right. Relationships are important, and we do want to know that we're on the same team, but oftentimes, in a coach's mind, we want to know that, you know, everyone else has the same best interest for our student athletes that we have, and not just for us and our jobs, but for our programs in general, that the biggest focal point is the best interest. And so even if that's not the answer we want to hear, what's best for us is what's important. So having that relationship is truly important, like Brian said. I think another part of that is like Bud said, know your job. We want to know that when we come and ask you a question, that the answer is going to be accurate, not something that's going to set us back, not something that's going to cause us further issues or problems, but something that is going to be informative, accurate, and enlightening, something that is actually going to make sure that our job is done right, our job is done better, and then we're able to move forward properly together.
That's great. And finally, Trey, from your perspective, what do you think makes a compliance administrator more appealing to work with?
I was saying I would echo what Brian and Tashia was saying, because relationships at the end of the day are crucial. And I think that they are obviously very important. But I'll also say constant communication. Obviously, don't just have or come over to football or whatever sport you have just when there's an issue or when a coach has a question. Just always providing any type of feedback or any updates to coaches are crucial and very important to obviously just stay on the same page.
Awesome. I think that's all really good info and great insight from a coach's perspective. All right, I'm gonna switch gears a little bit. You know, I think we all know from a compliance side that you have a variety of questions coming at you from all different angles on all different topics. So this next question goes out to Chris and Mason. What tips do you have for a new compliance administrator coming in and inevitably coming up to the dreaded no and giving that dreaded no answer to a coach?
Mason, I'll take the first stab at this one. The dreaded no. You know, a lot of times on campus, compliance administrators get, you know, basically tasked with being the no person. I think that comes with a lot of challenges. Specifically, though, you could utilize the resources. PJ did a great job previously about outlining the different resources that are available to you. LSDBI, case precedent, RSRO, historical knowledge that comes with proposals. Those are all basically some tools you can utilize to talk to your coaches to say, hey, the reason this is a no is because of this intent of the bylaw. Or back in 1999, the Coaches Association believed that there were some nefarious activities going on in this recruiting space. Another thing to kind of switch gears with the coaches is ask them what their intent is. Is there some reason they want to do this, or is there some question? What's the underlying thing that they want to do? Many times I was faced with situations in which a coach really wanted to do something, but the way that they were doing it was going to be a no, but a few things tinkered here and there, we actually got to an approval. So really try to meet them halfway or compromise if possible.
That's great. Mason, what are your tips?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Chris nailed it. And I think really it's the explaining the why and explaining maybe a permissible way to do something. So one way that the coaches or the sports staff or whoever might want to go about something isn't okay, but like Chris mentioned, if you know kind of what their ultimate end goal is, then you can help them get to something permissibly because, you know, like Brian and Tashia and Trey all said, like compliance and the sports are all on the same team, and it can help in that space if you can help them get to a place that is okay.
That's great. That's great. Kind of a follow-up question for you guys, kind of along the same lines, Chris and Mason. You are going down that road. You come to a conclusion of whether it's going to be a no or a yes, and the conversation is just not turning out well, and the coach is maybe pressing you and saying, hey, institution X down the road is able to do this or is doing this. How are you guys handling when a conversation just doesn't seem to be getting to a productive point?
So I think kind of the first thing I would do when I was on campus, if a coach or someone came to my office and they were like, well, school down the road is doing this, I want to be able to do this too, and we take a look at it and we think that it's not permissible, the first thing I always offer to the coach is I'm happy to call that school and see how they're doing it permissibly. Because sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes what would come back when you talk with the school is that they are doing it permissibly, but maybe we didn't have all the information on how they were getting there. And so it's a way that you can hear from the other school and see how they're doing it. We also use our conference office a lot as a resource. We use not only everyone in our office, but our conference office. So if we thought that another school wasn't doing it correctly and we were trying to do it correctly, we'd reach out to the conference and ask, how can we get here permissibly, or what can we do? So we worked with our conference office a lot in that space whenever we maybe had something that coaches were wanting to do and that another school was maybe doing a little bit differently, but we couldn't figure out how to get there, and we'd work with the SEC on that.
That's great. Chris, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, Mason, I think you harped on some really important points. Just one other thing I'd like to add is, or two other things, is to make sure you remain cool. It's very easy to get combative in those kind of situations, but just remember, maintain your cool, and the worst thing you could do, or the best thing you could do in this situation is say, hey, you know what, maybe I'll take another look at it. There are many times where a coach would say, hey, such and such school is doing this down the road. I don't know how they're doing it. Are you sure you're right? Sometimes a way to get out of that is say, hey, do you mind providing me an example of what they're doing? Because there are times where it's kind of the telephone game between people. I heard that such and such school is doing this, or this school is doing this. And then if you get an example, you can take a look at it. And we know in compliance, there's a whole bunch of nuanced questions. Certain things here or there could change the interpretation. And, maybe getting that example could help your coach out. And you could be able to call the school, not only network on your end, but gather additional information.
That's great, both of you. I think one thing that I'm honing in on is, I think compliance is a hard enough job, and relying on our colleagues within our conference, outside of your conference, your close group of compliance colleagues you trust, and remembering we're all on the same team and trying to get to the same outcome. So I think that's super helpful. I think, Brian and Trey, I'd love to hear your perspective from the coach's side. Maybe in a similar situation where you've asked a question and maybe you thought the answer was going to be yes and it turned into a no, or vice versa. How tips you have from a coach's perspective and handling those type of conversations?
I think that's a great question, and I love what Mason and Chris said regarding contacting other schools. I know that's something as a coach, you certainly hear the scuttlebutt of this school is doing things a certain way, or that school is doing it a certain way. But, Chris mentioned, keeping your cool. I think that's important. And I think it's also valuable to not necessarily look at it as a slap in the face just because a coach suggests reaching out to another school or says that another school is doing something permissibly that you might not think is permissible. Being open is such an important quality to have, and just being willing to reach out to the other school. And I think that asking the coach some more specifics will help, because I think what you'll find oftentimes is, like Chris said, it's a game of telephone. That coach might not have all the information as well. And when you kind of press them a little bit in a good way about the specifics of the situation, sometimes they'll just back down and say, well, never mind, it's not a big deal. Let's figure out how to do it in a different way, because they don't necessarily have all the information, or the truth is it might not be true. that the other school is doing it in that manner. So being open, being willing to reach out to other schools, because oftentimes other practitioners might have some additional information that you might not have. And like other people have said, the ability to network and kind of scratch each other's back is so valuable, because compliance people definitely need each other in the long run.
Thanks, Brian. Trey, what comments do you have?
Yeah, I mean, Brian makes the best point, particularly when you talk about just calling around to different schools. It definitely rings. It definitely comes to mind for me, because most of the information that we would receive really within football would come strictly from other coaches that we're obviously conversating with and having that we have relationships with. And so obviously, if there is a piece of information that we feel like could help us, obviously we're going to ask our coaches, maybe our coaches' friends, maybe other schools, like, how did this happen? You know, what can be done? How are you doing this? So on and so forth. And so really being able to communicate that, I think is crucial.
That's great. I think, Trey, you bring up a good point. I can't tell you how many times, I've never been a coach, but from my perspective and the conversations I've heard of, especially out on the recruiting road and chatting and talking and comparing, especially legislative rules, recruiting rules. So having, those coaches are having those conversations and bringing them back to your compliance folks.
Hey, Sarah, one thing that I'd love to add to that conversation would just be, when you are willing to reach out to another school, that's just another form of building trust with your coaches. Because like we talked about before, it just shows your willingness to kind of go the extra step, the extra mile, to kind of step outside of your comfort zone and outside of your personal box and reach out to somebody different. And I think that even if the answer ultimately comes back as a no-go, the coach will respect the fact that you were willing to try. And I think that's ultimately all coaches care about is, are you willing to put in that effort? Are you willing to, be on my team? Are we in this thing together? And I think they get that when they see you kind of step outside of the normal lanes.
That's great. That's great. Angela, I'll turn it over to you.
Yep, no problem. So one of the things that compliance administrators often do not get enough credit for, in my personal opinion, is the amount of education that you provide to people within the department, and especially your coaches. And so I want to ask Tashia, from your perspective, what types of education have you found to be helpful from the compliance office when it comes to navigating the very complex NCAA legislation?
What I found to be most helpful is we keep talking about this relationship piece and building that relationship. And so that is obviously the biggest part of it, but that comes in having the conversation. So if you're going to educate a coach, majority of the time, no, it's not easy to merge schedules or to meet or find time to talk, but it's going to be more appreciated if you show your face in an office, or, we get the opportunity to meet you somewhere neutral, where it feels like there's going to be common ground, where no one has the upper hand, but to be able to have the conversation, to understand it and get a chance to ask questions. Because a lot of times there are things with coaches not working with the legislation every day, there's going to be a level of understanding that's missing that can be provided by compliance, since they do deal in it every day. So that initial conversation, to hear what's being said, to have a chance to analyze and to process and then ask questions. A good practice after that is to follow up with your coach. Send them a PDF or send them a link to the information that you just discussed, to keep it at the front of their mind. And after you do that, then if there's any questions, encourage them in that email to say, hey, if you have any follow-up questions or any additional information that you need, please ask me. And if you have examples, as Brian and Trey talked about, from other coaches or compliance offices where something has been done and they've found out a way to do it, then provide that as well. Provide proof. Provide a way for a coach to, one, have a sounding board and a conversation to try and understand it on the front end, but follow up with that same information to keep it at the front of their mind and maybe have it for later, so then you don't have to continue to have the same conversations because you've already provided the information. make it easier for you both to have that same information that they're looking for. So a conversation first, follow up after, and then from there, just continue to build that relationship, continue to have open lines of communication. That's really what worked that I found.
I think that's pretty practical and helpful advice, Shia, so I appreciate your honesty in that answer. I think from a compliance administrator standpoint, you know, maybe I asked this to Mason, you know, during your time on campus, what educational tools did you find that were helpful when talking with coaches when you are trying to explain those difficult concepts and legislative issues?
Yeah, so we used email a lot, like Tashia mentioned, and followed up conversations with email. So we had, as part of our education, we had a calendar system. And so each month we printed out our calendar, and every person in our office had their things that they were supposed to do as far as education that month. So in August, it was very recruiting heavy, and you were talking about official visits, unofficial visits right before the first home football games. Whereas in October, that's when you finally started talking about NLIs and getting ready for National Signing Day starting in November. And so it was very cyclical. We used email for that. We also at Ole Miss used Twitter. Lots of compliance offices have Twitter now that they put out kind of general information, maybe put out the recruiting calendars. Major infractions cases we would do links to. We used all of that for education. Obviously, monthly coaches meetings are very popular across campus. It gives you a chance to see your coaches in person, to have some of those conversations that Tashia was talking about in kind of a neutral place, one-on-one maybe if they have questions afterwards over things that you've discussed. Again, we made them very cyclical, so it made sense. You weren't talking about National Signing Day in May right before they go away for the summer, things of that sort. And then I think also to Tashia's point, follow up in writing with your coaches and break it down for them. Compliance administrators, I think, forget that we live in these rules and the manual every day with everything that we do. And it's not our coaches' jobs to do that. It's our job to help them understand what they can and can't do. And so, you know, breaking it down in an email for them afterwards, sending them what the bylaw is, maybe the ed column that's tied to it. The last thing I'll say is that we utilize PowerPoint and Adobe Spark quite a bit, two really great tools that can give your coaches something that they can kind of flip through and look through, maybe in a more digestible visual way.
Thanks, Mason.
Awesome. Well, I think as we wrap up our discussion with the panel, I'm going to pose one more question to all of you and make it pretty open and broad. So feel free to expand upon what we've talked about, or if you go a totally different direction, that's okay too. What we'd like to hear from each of you is just a piece of advice that you would like to give a new compliance administrator as they venture through this athletics profession. So let's go the same order that we did our introductions, and I'll start with Chris.
Thanks, Sarah. I think it's important. I think Brian and Trey and Tashia both harped on this, is your relationship with your coaches. Brian did mention earlier, don't always come around with bad news. Coaches want someone that's invested in their program just as much as they are. Yes, we're in a difficult spot as compliance individuals where we have to kind of toe the line between what's permissible and what's not, but that doesn't mean that you can't have a great relationship with your coach. And I think having that great relationship with your coach is a vital aspect in eventually having those conversations of, no, we can't do this, I'm sorry. And those go a long way, and I do think that's important. So as a new compliance person, try to get in front of your coaches as much as possible, whether that's tagging along in a meeting with your associate AD or someone else, and then later on down the road, having your meetings one-on-one with coaches. Sometimes coaches just really want to be heard and have someone to talk to, and that really helps long-term in your relationship, and ultimately makes those decision-makings where you have to say no, or you have to tailor an answer to what they want or they don't want. So biggest thing to take out of that is relationship building.
Awesome. I'll throw it over to you, Bud.
Yeah, just gonna give you an old quote that I like. Bloom where you're planted. I mean, don't get caught up in all the big picture items early on. Managing managing the tasks that are in front of you is really important. Be great at those. It doesn't matter if it feels small, boring, seemingly insignificant. You handle your task well, more will come. If you're lucky, more tasks than you can handle will come your way. So just do the best you can with what you have in front of you. It's my advice.
Awesome. I'll throw it over to Mason.
So it's been mentioned, but I'll just say it again. I think don't be afraid to say that you don't know an answer. You don't have to have all the answers right off the bat. None of us know that manual forwards and backwards as much as we would like to think we do. And I think you'll go a lot further with not only coaches, but with other people in other departments across campus if you can say and admit that you don't know something, but that you'll find the answer and that you'll work hard to get an answer for them, and then follow up with them quickly. You know, try to get it to them that day if you can. If not, touch base with them the next day and let them know where it is, and just have constant communication with them. But don't be afraid to say that you don't know something.
Sashia, what do you got for us?
Definitely listen more than you speak. And I know that sounds absurd, but it's the truth. As Chris said, coaches want to be heard and sometimes just have someone to talk to. But not only is it from your coaches that you should listen more than you speak, it's with the other administrators that you work with and under. They've been doing this for a while, and there are a lot of ways and things that go on that you don't understand and you don't know. So the best way to really learn your craft and grow where you're planted, as Bud said, is to listen. You know, listen and don't act like you know everything. Don't always open your mouth before you have a true answer. Take the time to listen and be open and figure out what it is that you need to know to be the best at what you do.
All right, what words of wisdom do you have for our compliance administrators?
Yeah, I would say be present. I know compliance has a really hard job, obviously depending on the size of your staff, depending on where you're at from an institution standpoint. You know, being present, being around, being available. Those are three things that I know always kind of have been a go-to for me in dealing with any situation or trying to build any relationship. So those will be my three: be available, be present, and you know, be around.
Good. Those are really good. Brian, take us home.
I'll do my best. You know, the last piece of advice I have is to be timely, not just in your responses to, you know, a question the coach might have, but more importantly, sometimes is truly understanding the ebbs and flows of the year and the season. I think that's such an important thing to understand. What part of the season or the year is your coach in? You know, understanding, you know, how far a note after a win or a loss can go with the coach, and understanding that they're kind of living and dying on every day and having some respect for that. And also, you know, when it comes to education and whatnot, just being timely in the things that you address. You know, address recruiting stuff when it's recruiting time. Address playing season stuff when that's coming to the forefront. But just making sure that your agendas and your topics of conversation are timely based on the necessity of that coach in that playing season.
I think we just all heard some great advice. I'm taking notes still. I think I still have things to learn in my career. And I just want to thank all of our panelists today for taking time out of their day and giving us insight into the wonderful world of compliance and coaching, for that matter. We really appreciate all of our participants getting on today for our first session of Welcome to the World of Compliance. So again, appreciate all of our panelists today. Couldn't do it without them. I hope everyone stays healthy and stays during these times. Thank you so much.